Welcome to STEM Talk.
STEM Talk. STEM Talk. STEM Talk. STEM Talk.
STEM Talk.
Welcome to STEM Talk, where we introduce you to fascinating people who passionately inhabit the scientific and technical frontiers of our society. Hi, I'm your host, Dawn Cornegas, and joining me to introduce today's podcast is the man behind the curtain, Dr. Ken Ford, IHMC's director and chairman of the double secret selection committee that selects all of the guests to appear on STEM Talk.
Hi, Don. Great to be here. I have known Stuart McGill for a number of years, and today's interview was a special treat for me. Stuart spent over 30 years as a professor of spine biomechanics at the University of Waterloo in Canada, and his lab has become a renowned destination for everyday people as well as Olympic and professional athletes who are struggling with back pain.
I had no idea until our interview with Stuart that back pain has become the world's leading cause of disability.
Yes, and Stuart has been at the forefront of non-surgical procedures to addressing back pain for many years. His recent book, Back Mechanic: The Secrets to a Healthy Spine Your Doctor Isn't Telling You About, is a wonderfully accessible account of his methods and perspectives. A link to this book and to his website, BackFit Pro, are in the show notes for this episode.
But before we get to today's interview with Stuart, we have some housekeeping to take care of. First, we really appreciate all of you who have subscribed to STEM Talk, and we are especially appreciative of all the wonderful 5-star reviews piling up on iTunes. As we announced in several earlier episodes, the Double Secret Selection Committee has been continually and carefully reviewing the iTunes reviews with an eye towards selecting the wittiest and lavishly praise-filled reviews to read on STEM Talk. As always, if you hear your review read on STEM Talk, just contact us at stemtalk@ihmc.us to claim your official STEM Talk t-shirt.
Today, our winning review was posted by someone who goes by the nickname Total Whole Bean. I wonder what a fractionated bean would look like. In any case, the wonderful review is titled, "What You're Doing, Keep Doing It." The guests you have and the questions you ask have been so fascinating. Normally, with a podcast, I like to hear as I'm doing other errands or exercise. With yours, I have to sit down and really listen, since each sentence is packed with so much science and details I don't want to miss. With all of the fake news and explanations filled with lots of inflammatory opinions out there, it is refreshing to hear people talk with integrity, critical thinking skills, and humbleness.
Well, thank you, Whole Being, and thank you to all the other STEM Talk listeners who have helped STEM Talk get off to such a great start.
Okay, now on to today's interview with Stuart McGill.
Dr. Stuart McGill is a professor of spine biomechanics at the University of Waterloo in Ontario, Canada, and the author of more than 300 scientific publications and 3 textbooks that address issues such as lumbar spine function and injury mechanisms, patient assessment, corrective exercise prescription, and performance training.
He has led a laboratory at the University of Waterloo that attracted people from around the world, including professional and Olympic athletes. Dr. McGill has been teaching students and clinicians for more than 30 years. He also consults for many medical management groups, governments, corporations, legal firms, and elite sport teams. He has won numerous awards, including the prestigious Volvo Bioengineering Award for low back pain research.
In 2002, he released his landmark text, Low Back Disorders, Evidence-Based Prevention and Rehabilitation. It changed the way coaches, bodybuilders, athletes, and non-athletes approach core training. His new book is Back Mechanic: The Secrets to a Healthy Spine Your Doctor Isn't Telling You. Written for a lay audience, the book addresses common misperceptions about back pain and includes a step-by-step guide of the McGill method to fix that pain.
STEM Talk. STEM Talk. STEM Talk. STEM Talk.
STEM Talk.
Hi, I'm Dawn Cornegas. I'm your host for STEM Talk, and today we have with us Stuart McGill. Stuart, welcome to the podcast.
Good afternoon, Dawn. Thank you very much.
And we also have Ken Ford joining us today as my co-host.
Great to be here.
Great to have you here. So, Stuart, can you talk a little bit about your background and what drew you into biomechanics, and then how you decided to dedicate your career to the study of low back pain?
That is probably the worst possible question you could ask me because I have never had a plan or anything that drew me anywhere, and this will confuse your listenership, I'm sure. To make a long story short, I've only ever done things that people asked me to do. I wasn't going to be a scientist or even a university student. I was more interested in becoming a plumber. And it was the high school football coach that said, "Would you be interested in coming back and completing high school?" And I went to university with no real interest in academics, but I met some fantastic professors who turned me on to mathematics and physics and things that were not possible for my brain to understand as a high school student. And slowly that morphed into a master's degree and then into a PhD. And as I was finishing up my PhD, I had a conversation with the dean who offered, "We don't have a position for you, but we don't want you to go. Would you be interested in staying on soft money, and we'll try and find a position for you?" And that's how it all started. And I didn't even really know what biomechanics was as a master's student, but I met a professor playing for the professor's hockey team at University of Ottawa. And he said, "Well, we're starting spine biomechanics. Would you like to come and visit our lab?" And it was as simple as that. So you can see my life has been very random. But I can tell you this. I love to study mechanisms and how things work. So whether it was water flow in pipes or this crazy thing called a spine that is a stacked pile of vertebra, and how it allows us to dance and throw things and kick things and play football and golf. It's a never-ending system to study.
Fantastic. I think that's a great answer, and I think a lot of the most interesting paths are very similar to yours in that they were never planned outright.
I've enjoyed reading many of your scholarly papers, and I must say they're broader in methodological and conceptual scope than one would normally find in a single lab or even in a single school. Like some of these would be in a medical school, some would be in a biomechanics lab. They're quite broad. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about what must be a pretty unique research atmosphere that you've created there at Waterloo.
Well, yeah, again, our mandate has always been, I will do anything with anybody using any technique as long as I can learn something unique about the back, how it functions, how it becomes injured, ways to rehabilitate it, ways to pull maximum performance out of it. And that takes us into the world of engineering, psychology, physiology, anatomy, pharmacy. It never ends, Ken.
I can see that.
Yeah, and Stuart, and so with this eclectic background that you've talked about, from what I understand, you weren't trained as a clinician per se. So how did you come to a place where you started working directly with people with back pain?
People wonder all the time, what medical school did I go to? And I say, well, I've taught at an awful lot of them, but I never went to any of them, and I certainly didn't graduate from one. As a young professor, I would be asked to give talks at orthopedic meetings and neurology meetings, and the docs would say, that's really interesting what you just showed us about that mechanism of pain or injury or whatever it happened to be. Would you come and see a patient with us that is a bit of an enigma for us? And I would say, well, no, I'm not a clinician. And they said, well, come with us anyway. We'll be with you. And slowly I learned, actually it was quite quickly I learned, that what I would see in a patient was not what they were taught to see. And I would be able to provide a unique insight. And quite quickly I became very comfortable around patients. And I'll use the word polluted or biased. I wasn't polluted by medical school training. My father always taught me. He would take me to business meetings as a young kid, and he would say, whoever you are with at that instant, you are their equal. And it doesn't matter whether they're the superstar of the NBA or an undergraduate student or an older person who's got a few miles on their body, you treat them the same way. And I would ask patients, tell me your story. And the docs would be looking at their watches. And I would say, please tell me your story. And they would describe for me why and the critical information I needed to understand why they were in the pain situation that they were. I would understand what activities made them better, what made them worse, what time of day, what the symptoms actually felt like. Why aren't you doing your exercise? Oh, you live in a neighborhood that if you walked at night, it would risk your health. You're in danger. So now I'm learning things that were impediments to them getting better. And it was just this whole study the person, which is what I did, which was foreign to them. And then add in, yes, all the formal medical things, but then really take those items to the limits of our knowledge. And I found that we were having successes that with people they were writing off as 100% disabled, or your only option left is surgery, or whatever.
That's fantastic. So you're looking at the person as a system, like you've looked at all these other things in your life, which is fantastic.
Sort of systems engineering.
Systems engineering.
Well, that was it. You don't know this, but I was actually going to start my PhD in systems engineering, and it was the chance meeting with my eventual PhD mentor, Bob Norman, who said, come on over and see the spine lab. So I switched from systems engineering. So there you go. You're very perceptive, Ken.
Well, you're kind of still doing it, and
I think I am.
I can sort of, from the patient's point of view, say it's a remarkable experience being assessed. You know, the assessment takes about 3 hours. At least that's what I was there, about 3 hours in the assessment phase. And I understand from Dr. McGill that typically very few visits, often just one visit. That's it. So that was not my normal experience.
It's a thorough listening session and getting all the details in place, which
right.
typically you would never receive, or very rarely receive in a typical clinical setting. So,
well, as Ken may tell you, he did fly up to see me, and we sat on the couch, which we always start. And you'll notice, Ken, that there was a fireplace in front of you. That was all by design. That was very specifically to create an atmosphere where I could get as comfortable and familiar with the patient as soon as possible. And I needed them to tell me the real things in their lives that mattered, what their real goals were, what the impediments were. And lock me on. And then it was after a half an hour conversation, I am now prepared to look at their back and their bodies.
Right.
But now I had a context. I knew what things I needed to test, probe, provoke to reach that precise diagnosis that was going to guide them.
You seem to be observing all the movements and sitting, and I don't know if that's true, but it seemed like I was being assessed from the very beginning.
You were assessed the second you got out of the car, but you don't know this. I was at the window. The patients come, and I watch the person get out of their car.
Yeah.
I watch them walk up the driveway. I have already observed if they have a nerve deficit. I will have seen it. I ask everyone to take their shoes off. How they move. I've already started my hip assessment, for example. How they pick up their backpack, how they get in and out of that couch that I've already described, and then we walk downstairs. So I've already learned quite a bit, but the assessment starts. And when I was at the university, I had a crack in my door, and it was creepy. I would look through the crack in my door at how the patient was sitting, because curiously enough, most patients sit in their pain. So if you see them sitting there slouched, looking down at the ground, a very flexed posture, 9 times out of 10, that was what drove their pain. If you saw them sitting very upright and into an locked extension position, and how they get out of the chair is in locked extension, guess what? Chances are they will be extension intolerant. So these are clues that if you mention this to the doesn't resonate.
Right. No, that's fantastic. I think I'm going to be flying to Canada. So for an assessment, I'll say just in the few 10 minutes before we start this podcast, Stuart and I were already talking about some things, and he started to kind of figure things out probably faster than all the docs that I've seen in the past decade or so about my lower back. So, so Stuart, you published hundreds of scientific papers and 3 textbooks that are aimed at various segments of academics and also different professional communities. But now you have a recent book that just came out called Back Mechanic: The Secrets to a Healthy Spine Your Doctor Isn't Telling You. And this is written for the lay audience. Can you talk a little bit more about this book and what your motivations were in writing it?
Well, yes. The motivations are quite simple. An agent from New York came to me and said, "We've read your heavy clinical textbooks, and they help me with my back. Would you consider writing a book for the lay public?" And that wasn't my usual audience. So I said, well, yes, of course, I will. And by the way, she wasn't the first to ask. So it was the most difficult book I'd ever written. When she tried to sell it to the big publishing houses, they all came back and said, "For this to be a commercial success, you must write a book titled Fix Your Back in 5 Easy Steps."
Right.
And I said, "I am not doing it. It has no integrity. It's not possible. However, I will write a book with that seeks the balance between telling the truth, being complex enough that it will address the various subcategories of back pain, and still be simple enough to be consumable by the lay public." That took me 5 years. It was the most difficult thing I did. But what the book does is it starts out giving a code, something that is somewhat of a set of rules to live by for a reasonably pain-free functional back. Then I dispel a few myths. And then because a person might wait a while to get an appointment to have their back seen by a back specialist, and then if they're lucky, they might get 15 minutes. It is not possible in that time for them to leave with a precise diagnosis of their pain triggers. So they are left with, take an analgesic, or worse yet, the pain is in your head, which, if you wanted to create psychological disorders, tell someone that the pain is in their head and they're a nutcase rather than they actually have a physical cause to their pain. So I then wrote the section on self-assessment, and I tried to boil down my 3-hour assessment into about 9 tests that would show them whether a certain bending, or basically it was a motion, a posture, and a load, which combinations of those increased the pain and which took the pain away. Then I could give them a subcategorization label so they would know, if you're going to tie your shoes, do it this way. And not that way. Swimming might be recommended for you, but for the next category, guess what? Swimming is actually going to exacerbate your back. So then the next section of the book is what we call spine hygiene. We remove the well-defined pain triggers now. Now, back pain is a rather curious beast in that you don't get used to it. The more you trigger your back pain, the more sensitive you become. The great lesson of it all is if you avoid the pain trigger, the back pain will desensitize. So once you've desensitized, you can go back to being a bad boy or a bad girl a little bit, tickle a dragon's tail, and you won't pay for it because now you're desensitized. But you've also built your body so it's able to receive therapeutic exercise. But can you imagine if you had a sore thumb and the doc said, here, do more bending, twisting of your thumb and hope it'll get better? No, it'll make it worse. But if you let your thumb settle, let the pain sensitivity settle down, then you can start doing very specific exercises to build a foundation for a functional thumb. Well, it's the same with the back. So the exercise bit is actually the third component. So you assess, you wind down the pain sensitivity by avoiding the cause, and then we teach you how to do everyday things. And then we create an exercise program to very specifically address the deficits that weren't there or were always there in the beginning. So that's the book.
Fantastic. Oh, well, I look forward to reading it. So although we know that back pain is the world's leading cause of medical disability, the medical community in general tends to dismiss it and not take it as seriously as it probably should. Do you know why that is? Can you expand on that a little bit?
Well, I'll start by saying this. There are very few specialists in back pain. Now, some people might say that's an arrogant thing to say, but, if you were a diabetic, okay, diabetes, it's rather homogeneous. The solutions are rather limited. But if I said, you have head pain, where would you start? You've just brought in every medical subspecialty known. Well, it's the same with back pain. And, if you go to a surgeon, well, they operate. If you go to a PT, they will probably give you corrective exercises. If you go to the pain clinic, they will most likely load you up on an analgesic or an addictive narcotic. But there are very few people who put all of that together. And when we do an assessment, we are looking for the psychosocial impediments as to why you're not getting better. We are looking for you may have a physiological concern or a comorbidity. In other words, there are very few people who have the spectrum of abilities and training to look at 20 different back patients who have 20 different subcategories of back pain. It's very non-homogeneous. So that is a scientific answer to the question. But the political answer to the question is the medical system is not designed to address a rather complex non-homogeneous condition like back pain. So you get a 15-minute appointment. It's not possible to reach a precise diagnosis that's going to show you what you should stop doing and then what you should do.
So, Stuart, what do you see as the most common mechanisms for back injury? And are there methods for preventing these injury mechanisms?
Well, the answer for that one starts with it depends. I would have to give several examples to answer that because the answer is very specific. So let's take your typical 30-year-old person who sits at a computer all day. Chances are they will have discogenic back pain coming from the discs. So they sit, they build up cumulative stress on the discs, and they become a bit achy. Now, if they then go to the gym for an hour and do not exercises to combat the cumulative stress of sitting all day, but they then go and do, repeated Olympic lifting and some of these other things, they've almost created a perfect storm. They would be wiser to, try and unstiffen the hips that probably were stiffened through that 8 hours of chronic exposure in the chair. You would probably want to remind the brain that they still own a pair of gluteal muscles in the back of their hips, and build the foundation that way, and perform quite pristine movement patterns using the hips, not bending the spine into flexion anymore because they've already created a cumulative stress in that way. Now, interestingly enough, many of those people will be told they have degenerative disc disease or something like that. There's no such thing. That type of discogenic pain will peak in their 30s and 40s, and it will slowly disappear in their 50s, and it'll be gone in their 60s. So you don't hear old people complain about that sort of back pain. Now I'm going to answer the question for another category. Let's take a 70-year-old person now. They're retired, and they like to go for their afternoon walks, but they're starting to get a numbness down their legs after they walk for 10 minutes. They're starting to stoop over a little bit. This is very typical of the arthritic stenotic spine. The traditional approach is to don't get them to extend and compress the nerve roots posteriorly, but maybe they should ride a bike or walk with a cane or a rollator, a walker, and keep them in this flexed position and avoid extension at all costs. Well, interestingly enough, just over half of those people will do very well by giving them interval walks. So say those symptoms start after 4 or 5 minutes. At the 4-minute, walk up to the back of their car or the back of a park bench, for example, put the heels of their hands on the back of the bench and let their hips drift towards the bench to lift their chest up and extend their spine slightly, which would be quite verboten in typical treatment of that syndrome. And more than half the time, after 30 seconds of that, when they return to standing, they'll say, my symptoms have resolved. And then they go and walk for another 4 or 5 minutes. The symptoms start again, and they go and do that, what we call a park bench decompression. So with a few cycles of that, all of a sudden they just walk 20 or 25 minutes pain-free, which they haven't done for a while. So it's a method of building back their tolerance. So that is an answer to the question, first of all, showing that there are 2 different subcategories of back pain, 2 totally different approaches and reasons why they get it and plans for getting them better. So does it work for everybody? No, it doesn't. But when you understand the mechanisms, it guides you with more precision as to what will help them.
You've done a lot of work with the military, elite athletes, and other organizations, including a study of firemen right here in Pensacola. Could you talk just a little bit about the nature of the project with the firemen, what the goals were, and what was learned?
Yeah, thanks for that, Ken, because we owe a lot to Pensacola. We partnered with the Andrews Institute, the Pensacola Fire Department, and in those days it was called Athletes Performance, but now it's called Exos, who, as you know, are elite trainers. They are very outstanding, highly trained people. And we had several questions. And I might also say that we had 2 PhD students live here for a year. And Dave Frost and Tyson Beach, and my collaborator on all of this was another professor, Jack Callahan. And we had several questions, but one question was, does excellence in coaching people transfer from the gymnasium out to the fire ground? This was a huge question because all this corrective exercise that firefighters, police officers, and the military were doing, how did you know that transferred out to the fire ground? What we discovered was we had 3 training groups. We just had a control group, obviously. And then one group that did exercise that you may be familiar with. They do 10 burpees and then 10 Olympic lifts, just squeeze out the reps and become very fit. And then the third group were trained by the Exos coaches who pointed out to them, that is a injury mechanism for the knee. Here's how you correct it. And when you're lifting something, sagittal plane motion for the spine, that what you just did wasn't the least stressful way that you could do that for your back. Here, we're going to change that technique a little bit. In other words, they were well coached in what we would call spine sparing, joint sparing, injury reducing movement. Then, by the way, this cost $500,000. We measured the guys doing firefighter tasks before we started, chopping holes in the roofs of a building, breaching a door, advancing a loaded fire hose, carrying ladders, dragging bodies, real firefighting tasks. Then at the end of those exercise trials, as I described, we measured them on the fire ground again. Those who only trained reps and just keep squeezing out the reps, yes, they got fit, but they moved more poorly with more injury mechanisms once they returned to the fire ground. You put more horsepower into a car with a worse frame and transmission. You know what's going to happen. The third group that had excellent movement coaching. They weren't ever taught to do fireground work. But when they went back and we measured them, they did it with more competent movement and less injury mechanism. So that was the first study that we know of that justifies professionalism in training and coaching. So that was good news for exos. But the other things that we found, we had to measure movement. And, there are all these commercially available tests and screens for movement. But the question was, do they really predict those people who are going to get injured, those people who are going to perform well? And as it turned out, we were able to come up with better measures of predictability of who would get hurt and who didn't, and who would perform better and who didn't. So we learned a lot. And as I said, we enjoyed our time in Pensacola, and it was time very well spent.
Do you know if the department has continued training along this perspective?
I do not, and I hope I can talk to the fire chief to find out if that legacy continued or not. I hope it did, but
that would be interesting for sure, right?
Yeah.
And so you're talking about this ability to predict, and as Ken mentioned, you've worked with many athletes and have, in some cases, salvaged their careers. I understand that you predicted that the golfer Rory McIlroy will suffer the same back pain fate as Tiger Woods did. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, I do not know Rory McIlroy, but I saw the commercials on TV. I can't remember who they were sponsored by, but somebody, and they had him doing Olympic lifting with great bravado on the television. And I looked at that and I thought, well, I know professional golfers, and I've restored a few of those careers. And you cannot have it both ways. And what I mean by that is golf requires a flexible body, a flexible spine, and they are tuned elastic athletes. Now, in order to perform Olympic lifts, you must toughen the collagen of the discs of your spine. They are not ball and socket joints, and you cannot treat them that way. So if you want a pliable spine and do yoga and play golf, great. You can adapt your spine to do that. If you then add heavy Olympic lifts, you just asked your spine to do precisely the opposite. You cannot have it both ways. So when I saw this counter philosophy in the training, and I can only assume that he was doing it because I saw it on these commercials, I knew that he would have a brilliant short career caused by the way he was training. And, you go back to the great golfers who had wonderful careers: Arnold Palmer, Jack Nicklaus, Gary Player. They weren't the weightlifters. And this is, to me, a great tragedy now. I've measured what is required to hit a golf ball a long way. If it was muscle and strength, every middle linebacker in this country would be hitting the long ball, but it's not possible for them. It is not possible.
That's right.
So it's when we get into tuning the body for athleticism, it is so counter-opposed strength and resilience to the elastic athlete of a golfer. So that's why we actually put together a program for golf, which was all about producing very brief muscle pulses to unleash the stored elastic energy. And they were not doing deep squats and loading their knees and hips. 70% of the power of a golf swing comes out of the trailing hip in external rotation. It's glute medius. It's the external rotators of the hip. It is not the deep squat muscle. And anyway, there's just a start if you want to get me going on that.
You sort of see something similar when you look at power hitters of old. We discussed this with Art Devaney recently. And, they were 175 pounds and elastic and powerful and fast bat speed. Guys like Hank Aaron were the all-time home run hitter, and he weighed about 170 or less. Or Kyle Yastrzemski, a Triple Crown winner. And today we have the impression that to be a long ball hitter, you have to be sort of a hulking figure. And I think that's interesting.
Well, I haven't measured the great baseball home run kings, Ken, but I've had a few as patients. But I have measured some of the great strikers in mixed martial arts and in the UFC, the fight league that you may have heard of. And the guys with the big muscles push their punches. And so the impact, it's a slower spread out over time. The guys who hit hard are the leaner ones who can unleash muscle, because when a muscle contracts, it does two things. It creates force and it creates stiffness. So the great sprinters, the great golfers, the great home run hitters are the ones who can create a very brief muscle pulse and let it go. In fact, when you measure the great pulsers, they can relax their muscles 6 times faster than the average guy on the street. Now, I've measured this. And the ones who are the knockout artists, a nice, clean, crisp, and I know it's not a nice, we're supposed to be in the game of preventing injury, but we're just talking about this as a mechanism of athleticism. It's the leaner fighters who can create a sharper, more impactful strike force with that neurology that we're talking about, the pulse, and the big muscle fellas are pushing their pulses and it's their punches, and it's actually softer. So I would be quite positive that that's what you're seeing with the baseball hitters as well. They've got to have the pulse, and they've got to have the ability to create the initial pulse to start the swing, and then unleash that elastic with relaxation.
Makes sense.
Makes sense. So there are reports that the rate of back surgery in the U.S. is about 5 times higher than that that's seen in other developed countries. For example, it's about 5 times higher than what you see in England. Do you have any thoughts on this?
I do. You get paid a lot to do a back surgery. I had a consult just last week of quite a well-known person who's had several back surgeries, and now they want to fuse his back, and they wanted my opinion. And I said, please don't. The career will be done. And their advisor is a surgeon. So what tool does a surgeon have? Well, they've had 3 cracks at it, or 4 cracks, I think it is now. And all they have left is the tool in their toolbox, a surgical tool, which will be a fusion. Sorry, I had a thought on this. Oh, I know what it was. I think it should be illegal to operate on a person's back until the surgeon has proven that the thing that they are going to cut out is the pain source. And I have a chapter in the book, Back Mechanic, actually, is surgery for you. Of all of those patients who are sent to us and have been told surgery is the only last resort. Look, you've been through physical therapy, you've been to the chiropractor, you've been to the pain clinic. All you have left is surgery. We follow up with every patient. 95% of those are able to avoid surgery. One of the biggest interventions that we do is this. We perform virtual surgery. What is that? I'm very dramatic and I make a big deal of it. I go and touch them on the shoulder and I say, there, you've just had virtual surgery. Now,
you're all done.
now surgery works in a lot of people because it's forced rest. Not because they've cut something out of your back that is there for a reason. They'll say, oh, well, you know, if I don't go and ride the elliptical for 20 minutes every day, I'll murder my husband or something. I'll go mentally nuts. And I'll say, fine, you go and have surgery. You won't be on the elliptical tomorrow. What we're going to do now is, there's your virtual surgery. Tomorrow you're going to behave like a post-surgical patient. We will get you out of bed. You're going to go for a brief walk. In a week, we'll start some very safe stabilization exercises for your back. We're going to do very gentle hip mobility exercises. In other words, we're going to build you back as a post-surgical patient. That will work 95% of the time, and I can stand by that because I follow up with every patient that we see. And
they don't require opioids.
Well, that's a whole nother discussion. My wife, if she hears this, she says, Stu, there's no word in the dictionary called whole nother, but anyway.
Well, Stuart, can you share with us some of the steps that you take to guide people through a self-assessment of the pain triggers in their own back?
Yes. I tell them to go get a clipboard and a piece of paper, and they start by writing down those activities that make their back pain worse. And then on the other half of the page, write down those activities that make their back pain better or at least are tolerable. So I'll give you an example. They might write, something that makes my back worse is strolling at the mall, window shopping. Well, that tells us that standing, static movement, their back doesn't like that. But if they can go and walk around the block twice, walking quickly, swinging their arms from the shoulders, we've just found a way to turn what was their exacerbator into their therapy. Now, what I just described is very indicative of someone with a disc bulge or a little bit of a flattened disc. They don't like static motion, but they like the gentle movement of fast walking, not slow walking. And so I ask several questions like that, and then I give a guide on how to interpret the answers to those questions. Another question might be, do you get a sharp pain in your back when you roll over in bed? If they say yes, they have joint instability. So gravity is nullified or neutral when you're laying in bed. And then when you roll, a little micro movement at the joint that might have a little bit of a flattened disc to it will trigger a nerve, and that will be a sharp pain. So that's a wonderful question to ask. So I ask them a series of questions that they write yes or no to. And then I guide them through 9 tests. I load their spine in compression. I change the tension on the spinal cord by moving their neck into different positions. So we'll find out if they have nerve traps, extension intolerance, flexion intolerance. In other words, they know how to treat an intolerance to a motion or a load, but they don't know how to treat a sacroiliac joint. Do you see what I mean? So I put it all in functional terms. Motions, postures, and loads that they can do and can't do. And they form, very interestingly, quite tight categories. And then I can say, good, you just fit category A. Here is the start of your program. The first order of business then is to avoid your cause. And we had off air a discussion about swimming. Well, swimming it doesn't cause disc bulges.
Yes.
Yeah. But if the person is extension intolerant through the discovery on the self-test that we take them through, we could tell them, you know what, front crawl or freestyle and breaststroke will irritate your back. And you've probably found that out, or at least the reader will have probably found that out quite naturally. But it's very reassuring to them. And I'm going to use the word empowering. It's interesting how when a person is told, the pain is in your head or whatever, or they've got worse yet, degenerative disc disease. You don't have a disease. What a terrible, terrible thing to tell a person. And they come to me, oh, I've got degenerative disc disease. If I'm like this now, what am I going to be like in 10 years? I'm going to say, you're going to be better in 10 years. Oh, but I have disease. No, you don't. Anyway, instead of giving them a mental disorder, you do precisely the opposite. You are empowering them by showing them they are in control of winding up their back pain or winding it down through the appropriate practice of spine hygiene. So it's so empowering for them to realize, yes, they can actually wind it all down. Anyway, that's where the assessment starts and that's where it ends. And then we get on to showing them how to wind down their pain triggers and then build the foundation for being pain-free.
That's fantastic. So you give them a chance to feel like they're in control. And you're kind of talking about this mental aspect of it. So how do biomechanics reconcile all the emerging evidence that shows, I think it's about 59% of people with low back pain have psychosocial disorders that range from depression to anxiety to substance abuse. How does that fit into the whole scheme of things?
Well, this is such an interesting conversation to turn to now because there are people, and they call themselves pain scientists, who say, oh, don't ever tell a person the cause of their pain. They'll obsess over it. They will become fearful of movement and all this kind of thing. And then they say the biomechanists don't know what they're talking about. Well, I don't know who it is they're talking about. I don't think they know our work at all, because for 30 years, I've been a professor for 32. We have worked to desensitize their pain, not by keeping people clueless and telling them the pain is in their head and just go off and move and you'll be fine. We do precisely the opposite. We don't treat them like 5-year-olds, and they tell us, thank you, you're the first doc who's not told us, treated us like a 5-year-old. You've explained to us what causes our pain. We now know how to address that. And they become so liberated by understanding through biomechanics their pain. They know what precisely to do to avoid it. Now, to answer your question and nail it right now, what about substance abuse and anxiety? If you tell a very solid citizen that the pain is in their head, and they know bloody well that when they go and play a game of pickup basketball with their son, they're crippled the next day, that pain is not in their head. They are doing something and their back falls apart. If you want to give someone mental anxiety, tell them the pain is in their head and they're a solid citizen. And they might just start to bend their mind and believe you. Many docs don't recognize that there is a specific cause to pain. Pain isn't normal, and so they prescribe an opiate. Now you tell me where that's going to go. Of course they become overusers of opioids. So this isn't cause and effect. This is association. Those people with back pain have been driven crazy and turned into drug addicts by the medical system.
Pushed into thinking this is the only solution to actually getting through day by day. Yeah.
Anyway,
really
you just got my passion up with that.
No, it has to be infuriating to see. So talk about, fixing things. Can you walk us through the McGill method to fix back pain?
Yes, I can, because of what we've talked about already, I can be fairly short on that. Assess and know your pain triggers. Then eliminate them, wind down the pain sensitivity, and then build a foundation for movement, which will start out by creating a little bit of stability in the back, because a stack of vertebra is inherently an unstable structure. But you have to move and dance. But when you pick up an outboard motor and put it on your boat, you're going to have to stabilize that stack. There's no other way around it. Mobilize the hips as much as you are able. If you have hip arthritis, obviously, you have to work around that one. Now, particularly in American culture that is so car-centric, people have lost the daily routine of walking. There is no substitute for interval walking. To have a healthy back, you must walk, not a mile a day, not 2 hours in the afternoon. The best efficacious walk is walk at lunch, breakfast, and dinner, and just go out for a quick 20-minute walk. So cumulatively, you've walked an hour, but you've spread it out over those 3 20-minute periods. That's the healthiest thing you can do for your back. And then, of course, after that, you build a spine suited to your body to do whatever it is you need to do to meet the demand of your job, your sport, your life, whether you're 70 or whether you're 20.
Mm-hmm. Fantastic.
So that's it in a nutshell.
So we hear a lot about core stability. What is that exactly?
Can I have 5 minutes on that one?
Yeah, absolutely.
Sure.
All right. There, I hear core stability all the time, and the kids on the internet and Facebook, calling people out and talking about core stability, and I don't think they have a clue. So let me see if I can give you 3 different definitions in a very functional way so we very precisely understand what core stability is. First of all, the body is an articulated linkage. So here at IHMC, robots and articulated linkages. In order to get distal mobility of an arm, you must have proximal stability. So take, for example, a backhoe. A backhoe has to put down stabilizers into the ground to allow the bucket to grasp earth and pull it. And if you don't, it pulls the tractor around. So, let me give you an example of the pec major, which is your chest muscle, your bench press muscle that crosses your shoulder joint. It's anchored proximally to the rib cage and distally to the humerus. If that muscle activates, it flexes your arm around distally, but proximally it bends your rib cage towards the joint. So if I was to push something just using that muscle, a bodybuilding muscle, I wouldn't be a very effective pusher. But if I locked down my core, my torso, with stiffness, 100% of that activation is then directed to distally pulling my arm around. So the sprinters who sprint faster have more core stability because the muscles that cross the hip, you don't want them to bend the proximal side. You don't want to bend your spine when you're running. You want your leg to move. Or serving a tennis ball. Why does Venus Williams grunt? It creates more core stability and more velocity on the arm distal to the ball and socket joint. So it is very performance enhancing, and even it's enabling. If you don't have core stability, you can't even walk. So that's a pretty critical thing, I would say. So that is the first element of core stability. It enables distal mobility and athleticism. The second component to it all is your vertebra is a stack of bones. It's a flexible rod. Now, no engineer would build a flexible rod and then ask it to bear compressive load. You would put a rigid steel beam there. So imagine taking a stack of oranges and putting a book on top and thinking that it's going to survive. But if you put guy wires attaching every one of those oranges down to the ground and in different directions, and then you tensioned each one of those guy wires, you could then put many books on top of that stack of oranges and it would survive. So we call that component sufficient stability. So when we measure people standing and then we add load to each arm, like say they were going to do a farmer's carry or something like that, you will see the brain organizing the muscles in front and side and back of the spine to form a guy wire system. That is absolutely essential to enable the condition of sufficient stability, which then allows you to bear a load. And then put down the farmer's walk and do a dance. Now you have to move that stack of oranges, or the vertical stack of vertebra, in a very coordinated way to move. So the orchestra, your brain, has to now play all those guy wires. You sacrifice stability for mobility. So that's the second element of core stability. If it's going to bear load, you better stiffen it. There's no other way. And we were the first, by the way, to measure and observe injuries occurring in people when they didn't have sufficient stability. We watched their spines buckle on video fluoroscopy. We were the first to observe that. That was back in the 80s. And that, in terms of our scientific development, motivated us to say we must become the best laboratory possible in our ability to measure and quantify stability. So that was a game changer for us in the 80s. The third element has to do directly with pain. Injury to a joint creates joint laxity. Imagine if you've got a torn ACL, a cruciate ligament in your knee. The doctor will do a drawer test on your knee, and they will feel a shearing instability in the knee, and it usually triggers pain. Well, we do exactly the same thing in people's spines. If we suspect micro movements at the joints are triggering pain, we probe with our thumb to create that pain trigger. Then we say, stiffen your abdominals. Poke your fingers into the abdominal obliques lateral to the navel and push your fingers out. Now, let me probe and see if that's instability or micro movement is still causing pain. And if it is a micro movement, you will engineer out the micro movement with the stabilizing girdling effect of the muscles. So there are three levels to help us in our discussion of what core stability is. One is to enable athleticism. One is to bear load and still move and dance. And the third is to arrest micro movements, which can be either proven or disproven to be the source of that individual's pain.
That was great.
Yeah, really clear. STEM Talk is an educational service of the Florida Institute for Human and Machine Cognition, a not-for-profit research lab pioneering groundbreaking technologies aimed at leveraging and extending human cognition, perception, locomotion, and resilience. Stu, can you talk about power breathing and the implications for spinal stability?
Yes. Well, this is nothing new. We go back 2,000 years into martial arts and learn how they knew how to potentiate the body. So there are several mechanisms going on, but one of them would be every engineer understands what a composite material is. As you know, I was at the Naval Hospital for the last couple of days teaching there, and we went through the Aircraft Museum, and they had, the old wood and wire biplanes there with the skin off, and you could see basically it was a skeleton with wires being the muscles. And then plywood was invented. Well, plywood is a composite. Plywood, so if you took a plank of wood that weighed 5 pounds and was a certain dimension, and then you replaced it with plywood that was 5 pounds and of the same dimension, it would be so much stiffer, so much stronger, and it wouldn't propagate cracks. So plywood was a brilliant composite for aircraft. Your body forms a composite. The fascial system, which is layers of bags, if you want to think of that, around collections of muscles in your body, when you activate and stiffen, it creates a composite, which creates super strength and super stiffness out of your body. All of that is potentiated with a power breath. So I'll just warn the listeners here, this may not sound very good, but if I went, pooh, like that. I hope the sound man didn't break his eardrums with that. But if I could coordinate that with a very pulsated push or a jump, I would have created that composite within my body, potentiated by the power breath, and I would have potentiated my performance and the strength of the push or the jump or whatever it was. So there's a little beginning of a start of power breathing, but it's an enormously potentiating mechanism.
I think it's greatly overlooked, actually. And this brings us right into kettlebells. We're both fans of these tools under the right circumstances, and power breathing is what one does when swinging a kettlebell. I wonder if we could talk a little bit about the exercises that you see most beneficial with kettlebells, and let's at least mention the swing and the various carries.
All right. Well, we both have a mutual friend in Pavel Tsatsouline, who came to this country and introduced the American public to kettlebells. A wonderful fella, and he introduced me to kettlebells. And I guess I was one of the first to quantify muscle activation patterns, joint loads, and those sorts of things with the carry and the kettlebell swing, etc. If you were to ask me what's my opinion of any exercise, my answer is almost always, I love it and I hate it. It depends. So with that background, let's talk about a swing. I absolutely love the kettlebell swing because it is a hip-hinging movement. You can create pulsing muscle patterns to, Ken, when you measure the great athletes, they don't really measure to be the strongest. They may not have the highest bench press, but boy, do they have the ability and the neural mechanical ability to create strong muscle pulses. Well, when you look at the traditional exercises done in the weight room, they don't address that.
No.
But the kettlebell swing addresses that. You're an old wrestler, you're an old athlete, and if you were gonna grip on someone's neck and do a neck drag, if you could pulse onto them, you would have an arm bar or whatever it is you're going to do. So the kettlebell swing creates this wonderful neurology of the pulsing muscle through the hip hinge, and we've had this discussion together before. A good set of hips with a good hip hinge will beat any other part of the body on an opponent any day of the week. Now I'm going to take a counter view on that. There are some very strong and very proficient athletes who will say, the kettlebell swing, I absolutely love it. It's what I used to reestablish the world record after my disc herniation. And then you'll have another athlete who says, I'm a strong guy. I can do a lot of things, but the kettlebell swing is the one little exercise that tweaks my back. And I fall into that category myself. I love the kettlebell swing, but after a couple of weeks of heavy swinging, my back starts to tweak a bit and let me know it's time to give it a rest. I've got a little bit of shear instability. So if we did a shear instability test on that person, if they passed, swing away.
What percentage of the population would you estimate has this shear instability?
I can't answer that, Ken, because every person who comes to me only comes with back pain. So I have a biased view. I've never done a shear instability test on the average population, so I don't know the answer to that one. But anyway, just to finish that off, so there is a good predictive test to either give the person a green light and go ahead and swing. But I even know some people who have shear instability and they tolerate it very well, because now we're going to get into a discussion on power breathing and bracing. So if they can cleverly and skillfully organize the power breath, which in of itself is stiffening and stabilizing at the top of the swing, not so much at the bottom, but at the top of the swing where the shear load increases on the spine, they will engineer out that possible pain trigger and the working of the spine in a shear mode. So there you go. I love the swing or I hate it. It depends on who we're talking about, but it is a fantastic potentiator of several types of athleticism and quite unique in that regard.
It's unique in that, it actually is, unlike most other resistance training, it's a display of athleticism itself and the pulsatile nature of it, the bracing that you mentioned. And I guess another thing I quite like about it is it's an opportunity to display physical power in a societally appropriate way.
I know. I'm going to say something that this won't surprise you, but it might surprise some of your listeners. You know that I've measured competitors in the World's Strongest Man competition, the NFL, heavyweight UFC fighters, in other words, some very, very impressive power athletes. Do you know who has the strongest core I've ever measured?
Probably a kettlebell dude like Pavel or something.
It's Pavel Tsatsouline. Yeah. So Pavel, I would estimate, weighs 185. Maybe he's getting soft on 190. I'm going to get a phone call after this.
I'm not a fat guy.
But he has a Herculean core. And so my advice to people is go have a look at his training. And he has created the strongest core I've ever measured, and he trains to stop twist, not to create twisting, but to stop it. He swings a kettle, he carries. He's quite a specimen, but I hope he will say, and I will say this, if you want to get strong, train like him, but if you have a bad back, come and see me.
That's a good balance.
But anyway, to move on to the carries. Again, we're one of the few who've measured and quantified carries. And the carries include strongman implements. But let's start with the kettlebell because, again, it's quite a unique device. So let's start off with carrying a load at the side. So carrying a load on either side with, say, a 16 or 32 kilo kettlebell in each hand. That's called a farmer's walk. It's a wonderful developer of quadratus lumborum, which is one of the biggest spine stabilizers going. If you do what's called a post, so when you squeeze the kettlebell horn or handle, that radiates up through the arm, into the shoulder. It activates latissimus dorsi. In other words, squeeze it hard and focus your grip through all of the fingers. It's a lot thicker. A real kettlebell, buy a quality kettlebell with good thick horns, thicker than a barbell handle, which is 1 1/8 of an inch in diameter. And anyway, now some people then think, well, actually, I'm going to start with a suitcase carry, which is you put one kettlebell down, you carry it on one side. So really, in total weight, you're only carrying half the load. But I can now prove that the load on the spine is actually higher because say you carry the kettle in the right hand, your left side of your torso has to create much more torque to balance the load. Those muscles impose a compressive penalty that is much higher than if you were carrying a kettle on the opposite side. So the progression of carries should actually start with a farmer's walk. You carry double the load, but you split it between the two hands. Then you graduate to the suitcase carry on just one side. Now, a wonderful feature of the kettlebell is you now rack the kettlebell so that your fist is over your elbow and beside your face, and you start to walk. Now, if you did that with a dumbbell, for example, your elbow would have to be under your hand. Well, look at the position of your shoulder. You've just impinged your shoulder. But if you carry a kettlebell racked, so the horn is in your hand, but the main cannonball part of the kettlebell is on the back of your wrist, it takes your shoulder out of impingement. So that would be the next level of progression. But finally, you want to get to a bottoms-up kettlebell because now you've got something very unique. The center of mass is well above your fist. Some people say, well, take a death grip on that horn and now carry the kettle. And I say, no, stiffen your core. And all of a sudden, that core will once again make you bring out your athleticism. And it teaches you such a unique athleticism of steering and directing the force vectors through the linkage. And as a robotics man, you know that is absolutely critical. And that's an athletic skill.
Absolutely. And, that's my very favorite. When you walk around the gym like that, everything is on. I mean, it takes your whole package to do a good job on that. And did you ever test
and you
the muscle
can't be
activation?
weak, by the way, Ken, and do that exercise. So there's that farm boy strength coming out that we've talked about in the past as well.
In your lab, did you look at bottoms up carries with respect to muscle activation and?
Absolutely. I can give you the paper on that.
Yeah, I'd love to see that.
It is. Let's go back to a real extreme example of this. If you go to the neurology ward of a children's hospital, you might find a little boy or girl in there who has a paralyzed quadratus lumborum. This is a muscle that runs up and down and lateral to the spine on either side. What that child will not be able to do very well is walk. Because when you walk, when you stand on your left leg and your right leg goes through a swing phase, you have to hold the pelvic platform up. So on the stance side, yes, you use your hip abductors, but on the swing leg side, you hold the pelvis up by contracting quadratus lumborum in the obliques. Well, if you have a paralyzed QL, you'll find that kid will stumble on that one leg with each gait cycle. Well, what's a more important function than walking, and what is a more important core stabilizer than the quadratus? And yet, how many people, can you think of an exercise, a traditional exercise done in the weight room that challenges quadratus lumborum? It doesn't exist until you get to a heavy carry, potentiated by a bottoms-up kettlebell. That is wonderful. And when I get back to who has the best core, and I said Pavel, we learned so much from Pavel. with these tools, these unique tools that he brought that were missing from the American tradition of strength and training.
Yes, the kettlebells make these kind of carries practical in a way that they're just otherwise very difficult. And I had gotten away from carries, and my friend Tyler Wilkins at Exos put me back on them a couple of years ago, and I'll always be grateful for that, because the bells make these carries practical, and the bottoms up carry you just couldn't do any other way.
Yeah, it's a fantastic exercise.
Hey, speaking of bottoms up carries, I have it on really good authority that Pavel played a trick on you once regarding bottoms up carry. Is that true? And do you feel like sharing the story?
Well, sure. He's going to kill me for this. But I remember the first time we were both younger. This is quite a number of years ago now. But we were down on Santa Monica Beach, and Pavel lives down in Santa Monica. And we went down to the beach with his kettlebells, playing in the sand with these things. And then he said, "Stu, you better put on some sunscreen." And, the sun was going down. Yeah. This was 7:00 at night. And I thought, no, I don't need them. He says, no, here, put on these sunglasses. And then he slathered my hands with sunscreen.
Oh,
and he said, put all this over your face. And of course, my hands were slippery. Yeah. And I'm like holding a wet fish there. Yeah, I was terribly embarrassed by the whole thing until I realized afterwards he was just having a play with the Canadian professor.
That's funny.
That's really good. So actually, it's funny because I'm just kind of offline. You and I talked about this earlier, so I'm going to ask you again so you can expand on it. So is it true that the spine is weaker and more vulnerable to injuries if you work out in the morning versus working out in the evening?
In certain ways, yes. I'll give you the scientific explanation and then the epidemiological evidence second. Your discs are hydrophilic. And what that means is they love water, they suck up fluid. So when you go to bed at night, you're actually shorter than when you wake up in the morning. And you'll notice it's harder to put your socks on in the morning. Your spinal discs are much more inflated. They don't like to bend. And it actually has about 3 times the stress in the annulus wall when you first get out of bed in the morning. So when we stress real spines, cadaveric spines, and we allow them to sit, simulating 8 hours of bed rest, they actually fracture with end plate fractures much more than later on in the day when we pressurize them with hydrostatic pressure mimicking gravity. So yes, the injuries change, and certainly the bending stresses. So we would really advise against anyone getting up in the morning and doing bending exercises, pulling their knees to their chest, doing sit-ups and those kinds of things. They would be much wiser just to wait an hour. Go for a walk and let gravity squeeze out some of the fluids. It would measurably reduce the disc stress, and it reduces the risk of central end plate damage. The epidemiological evidence comes from a Liberty Mutual insurance company who funds a lot of research to reduce injury risk and incidents because it gets people off their insurance liability roll. So their professor at the time, he's retired now, Stover Snook, did an experiment where he took populations and reduced their bending in the morning. And it was just a spine hygiene strategy. And he greatly reduced the back pain incidents just by telling the people, when you're tying your shoe in the morning, don't sit down on your chair, bend down and tie your shoe. Put your foot up on the seat pan of the chair, stand nice and tall, bend your support leg and move your hips down to the target, stay tall and tie your shoe. So you didn't exacerbate or add more stress to an already stress discs. But we can then parlay all of that into discussions of astronauts returning back from space and that kind of thing. We put a cohort of students to bed, and we measured the turgor in their discs. In other words, they went to bed. Over the next 8 hours, the hydration level of the discs returned to baseline. After 8 hours, and they kept laying in bed, their spines swelled. and they actually increased back pain. Well, when the astronauts go into space outside of gravity, their spines swell, and many of them are on analgesics for back pain, as you know. But when they come back to Earth, the discs, the incidence of herniated discs are much, much higher.
The issue is once you're back.
Absolutely. You now have gone to gravity with these superinflated discs, and they're so stressed that, and yet I'm just going to divert just one second, and yet we have many surgeons and many pain scientists saying, oh, we don't know what causes back pain. It has nothing to do with biomechanics. There's no evidence for it. It doesn't make your blood boil?
Oh.
Yeah.
It does. And following on those same lines, sciatica is a common complaint one hears. I mean, I have friends that are dealing with it, and one in which misdiagnosis is common, and the cause of the pain is usually misplaced or confused or unclear. Just, we don't know.
Right.
A colleague suffering from this was assigned the very exercises that you identify on page 111 of your book, and in a humorous way, you called them the silly stretches. And you point out that these can actually increase pain sensitivity. I was wondering if you'd just talk for a minute about that.
Yeah. Well, again, there are some docs who tell this is a condition of older people. And it usually is caused by narrowing of the discs and a little bit of arthritic activity in the vertebra, which make the hole that the lateral nerve roots come out, called the foramen, a little bit smaller. It gnaws away on the nerve roots, and they end up getting a little bit of numbness down their leg or tingling in their toes or whatever. And it's exacerbated by going for a walk, so they lose their ability to walk. The more usual treatment approach is to, go ride a bike, stay in flexion, don't walk, use a walker, use a cane, bend forward, etc.
Touch your toes.
And open up the nerve spaces behind by touching your toes and pulling your knees to the chest. Well, that may help a few, but what we find over half the time, we get a better effect by doing the opposite. We'll say, as I described earlier, the park bench decompression. Go for a walk before your symptoms start. And if you can only walk 5 minutes, great. Go walk for 4. Then walk up to a park bench, put the heels of your hands on the back of the bench, push down, anti-shrug, if you can imagine what I'm trying to describe. Down with the shoulders, and allow the hips to drift towards the back of the bench. So it's making you a little bit taller. And see if you can stay there for 30 seconds. Then ease off and stand up. More than half of the people will say, my symptoms have just resolved. And then go and walk for another 4 minutes. And then the symptoms start again, and away they go. Now, having said all of that, that is called sciatica because it's involving the sciatic root. That comes from the bottom 2 vertebrae, L4 and L5. The next vertebra above that, L1, 2, and 3, they form a plexus called the femoral nerve root, and that causes numbness and a distribution down the front of the leg, the quadriceps and thigh. So that might be called femoritica, maybe. I don't know. But
hey, don't put ideas in there.
Yeah. But then there is another condition called claudication. So instead of being an irritation of the nerve roots, it's actually a compromise of the vascular supply. And there are usually syndromes that are cofactors with all of that. For example, if I look at their legs and I see they're purpley, puffy, retaining water, they have erectile dysfunction. All of these things are forming a syndrome that you would say, let's take, the blood pressure cuffs and the blood flow restriction cuffs we were playing with earlier today, Ken. Put that on their leg and see if that replicates the symptoms. If it does, they've got claudication, not sciatica. So do you see, once again, if you understand the mechanisms of what's causing these somewhat similar symptoms, we now know how to be more precise in the treatment.
That's wonderful. In addition to silly stretches, you've identified a collection of silly exercises, such as sit-ups and crunches. And could you just really briefly elaborate on this a little bit?
Well, as you know, I've spent the last 2 days on the Navy base here in Pensacola. And in the American military, although I've been consulting with various people in the Navy for, I think, about 7 years now, I thought that they had abandoned the speed sit-up as part of their annual fitness test. But it's not occurred in all sectors, certainly not down here in Pensacola. Well, the Navy therapists and docs, they know that training for the speed sit-up test is causing back pain and grief. Now, here's where we get to the magnificence of government. Everyone knows what NIOSH is, the National Institute of Occupational Safety and Health. Their mandate is to use science to figure out exposure limits that are hazardous to the American population. So they have exposure limits for ionizing radiation and all kinds of things. They have established a limit for low back compression. It's 3,400 newtons. Guess how much the average male generates in back compression doing a sit-up? Just over 3,400 newtons. So here you have one branch of government who's mandated to protect the health of their population, and then you have the military service who says, do speed sit-ups, violating what has been shown by science to be a known increase or exacerbator cause of back pain. Now, does that make sense? So what some leaders in the Navy anyway have done is replace the speed sit-up with other tests. Now, I think they've gone to the plank. And they didn't want, special apparatus on every ship to measure this and all that kind of thing. And the plank is a problem because now you're stressing the people's shoulders. So it's not the ideal either. But nonetheless, when the sailors do that and don't train the sit-ups, they actually have less back pain and they score higher on the eventual sit-up test. So again, it's a transference of athleticism that if you understand the mechanism and know how to do it, you create a more able seaman or airman or whatever it is with less pain.
And one would imagine there's a huge variation across people with respect to how well their anatomy tolerates sit-ups. I remember when I was young, I was in a sit-up contest, which now looking back at it was very stupid. But it was how many sit-ups could you do in an hour? And the wiry, thin-boned people, the lightweight wrestlers and people like that, could do zillions of them. And the big, powerful people like football players very quickly were gassed out. And I think it had something to do with their anatomy. Is that correct?
Absolutely. This is absolutely true. Let me start off with an analogy that everyone will relate to. If you take a thin willow branch and bend it back and forth over and over again, it won't break. There's no stress that develops in that willow branch. But if you take a thicker branch and bend it to the same level, it will shatter because the stress in a tube is a function of its thickness. So when you take a thin spine, they are much more resilient to bending. If you take a thicker boned person and bend it to the same degree and the same number of cycles, the discs will delaminate and degrade at a much faster rate. So, again, would you take linemen from a football team and ask them to do speed sit-ups?
Seems silly.
Well, it is not silly. It's insane.
Yeah.
Now, if you had some very thin-boned gymnasts who by definition need flexibility, and you don't get big, heavy-boned people performing well at gymnasts. So there's a bit of self-selection here. But if you take those gymnasts they might do quite well on that. Although, again, I see the gymnasts when they're 50-year-olds as patients. You wouldn't want to be them
No.
either. But you're absolutely correct. There's a form and function to this. And again, it's just so irritating to hear people discount that there are reasons why certain people do well with that. They'll say, oh, well, some people do well on sit-ups. They don't matter. Well, come on, folks.
Yes.
There's a lot more to the mechanism, and the difference is you can't take a greyhound and expect it to win at the greyhound track. You can't take a St. Bernard and train it no matter how you want to train it to win at the greyhound. You will break it.
Yeah, I'm sure. It's a good analogy. We've been talking about exercise, and for a lot of people, probably with respect to backs, what sometimes folks call the McGill Big Three are a good place to start. I mean, that's what I started with. Should we run through those real quick?
Yeah, the big three, we didn't invent them, but we spent a lot of time evaluating different exercises for their ability to A, spare the spine, and B, ensure sufficient stability, that condition that we talked about earlier that allows you to both dance and bear heavy loads. It turned out that the bird dog, which is you're on all fours, and you first of all, get neutral curves to your back. So you really work at taking out all the stress from your back. Then you extend one leg behind you, extend the opposite arm out in front of you. That's only half the load on your spine, but then you can make a fist and push the heel and draw circles, do all kinds of things to really challenge the neuromuscular compartments of your back muscles. It's a wonderful exercise, very, very spine sparing. And then you had to challenge the side, the quadratus lumborum, the obliques. Doing a curl up with a twist was not the way to do that, as it turned out, but the side plank turned out to be a wonderful way to challenge latissimus dorsi, quadratus, etc., with only half the spine load once again. And then for the front, we ask people to lay on their back. Now, in Pilates, for example, it's a basic tenet of Pilates that you flatten your low back to the floor and segmentally curl up. But that stresses the spine of some people, particularly those who have a lot of lordosis and large buttocks. It's the way you would hurt their backs. So what we do there is we say, put your hands, palms down under your lumbar spine. Keep the natural curve. Keep it an elastic equilibrium and reduced stress. And now don't curl up your head and neck inches off the floor. Just lift your head, neck, and your shoulders half an inch. And I have NFL football players who are shaking after 10 seconds of that challenge. It isn't easy. But that was the way to create optimal guy wire systems in the front of your spine. So forget about speed sit-ups and some of these other things. But it doesn't challenge hip flexion, for example. So then we would add in, say, a dead bug type of exercise. So those are the big three, and they were scientifically validated as the optimal blend of minimal load on the spine, but maximum challenge to those guy wires, guaranteeing the condition of sufficient stability.
Great answer.
Awesome. So we were talking about anatomical differences and propensity to different types of back injury. What about genetic differences? Have any genes been identified for identifying people who might be susceptible to back injury? Because you would think you'd be able to identify, maybe younger people or people at a younger age and say, okay, now we can make sure that we try to prevent them from sustaining a back injury if we know that they're susceptible in the first place.
Right. Well, I can answer that question. But first of all, I have to admit, I am not your expert to talk about genetics. So I would have to say, I don't know from, if we were looking for genetic SNPs related to back pain. I'm sure there are. But let me go to the notion that you inherited your body type from your parents. Now, let's chase orthopedic disease. Where in the world is the highest rate of hip dysplasia? It happens to be Poland. Poles, on average, I'm not saying every Pole has this, but that spectrum of the population has the shallowest hip sockets. It allows them to deep squat. without hip impingement. So where do the Olympic lifters come from? Poland, Western Russia, Ukraine, Bulgaria, etc. But they have a very high rate of hip dysplasia with the ball slipping out of the socket because the socket's very shallow. They have fantastic, at least that hip has fantastic power out of the hole in the bottom of the squat. Now let's go to the polar opposite. Where is the highest rate of FAI, femoral acetabular impingement? In other words, the front of the hip is impinged when you squat. Well, that comes from the deepest hip sockets, and those are the Celtic nations of Normandy, France, Scotland, and Ireland. They've got the highest rate of FAI. How many Olympic lifters came from Scotland? Their strength is in the top half of the squat. Now, again, I'm not saying that every Scot has a deep hip socket, but on average, it's much deeper than other places. So they shouldn't be deep squatting. So let's take an American football team, and I am asked to come down and consult with some of your colleges because 30 to 40% of your football players will be on the disabled list with back pain. And I know exactly what I'm going in to see. Everyone must do power cleans off the floor. Now, when I measure their hips, which is just simply go on all fours and rock your buttocks back to your heels, and you will see the hip run out of room in the deep socketed players, and in their spines bend and break right away. It's not possible for them to pull an Olympic bar from the floor without being broken into what might be called butt wink, if you know what I mean. However, there's no shame in pulling the bar from a high block. And when you put the bar on a block, it doesn't mean you won't make the NFL. This is ridiculous. You still can pull power cleans, but you took out all the risk. So is that genetic? Absolutely. You inherited your hips from your parents. So if I can answer the question that way, yes, you tune the exercise to develop the athleticism to the genetic expression, the phenotype, which you see in their anatomy.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah, that just makes tremendous sense to me.
Yeah. Precision training. So
That's
well,
right.
I hope it does because it has to make sense to me. Otherwise, I don't do it. So I'm a pretty simple guy. It's got to be.
I think we have a mutual friend with a niggling L4, L5 disc bulge that is cranky, as he calls it, when he sits. And lately, when he does any type of spinal loading, like squats or deadlifts, could you talk about how you might structure sled drags and sled pulls for rehab in a case like this, and just some thoughts on how he might get on top of his situation?
Right. Well, I'm going to start that with everybody is an individual, and everyone starts with an assessment. So let's get past that, and assuming that we've done an assessment and I've ruled out any other nasty things that we have to take care of. Generally speaking, because of the influence of the internet, there's this great idea, if you want to be strong, you have to deadlift and all that kind of thing. Well, just a second now. What's the transference of that deadlift strength to the football field and the gridiron? What I would say in American training culture, there's too much emphasis of time under the bar and not enough emphasis of pushing heavy stuff around, pulling a sled, pushing a car out in the parking lot. These are tremendously strengthening and athletically enhancing activities. So now we get to the question of technique. Well, to be a spine-sparing sled drag, and you've got the rope leading to the sled behind you, so it's like a tail. Pull that right through so the force vector is up through your axial spinal column. Now you're becoming a draft horse. You're building big gluteal hamstring complexes, a good thick core, which is unique. A deadlift and the Olympic lifts, they're all done with 2 feet on the floor. But when you're on the gridiron, someone's on your back and you're on one leg, you're cutting at high speed. That is a one-legged strength. The same with pushing a car. I just sold it, but I had a Jeep with a set of bull bars on the front. and that was for the athletes to push. And there were several bars on it, and they could push at a level that the force reaction vector was driven down through approximately their navel, which took out all the shear and the bending moment on their spine, but they could push that Jeep back and forth. And they were absolutely gassed and couldn't believe that even though they could squat 800 pounds and power clean, 350, that they struggled pushing a Jeep.
Yeah, you left the parking brake on, right? Before we get away from this sort of self-care issue, I was recently at the gym, and I saw this guy completely working himself over with the knobbiest, gnarliest black foam roller, which I quite like for things like my quads, but he was really working on his spine with this very intense foam roller. And then when finished with that, commenced to have this sphere. It's like a little smaller than a softball maybe, and very, very hard. It wasn't, a racquetball or something. And same thing, up and down the sides of his spine. Is he trying to, I'm not sure what he was doing, but is there any hazard to him doing that? It seemed to me unwise.
It's very unwise. Now, I have no evidence or real opinion on foam rolling your quadriceps, your gluteal muscles, your latissimus dorsi. I don't know.
That, yeah.
But if you want to talk about foam rolling your lumbar spine, I would say absolutely stop. I want now 2 pieces of information. Why do you need to foam roll your back? And if there's a cause, we better remove it. So that's the first order of questioning. But the second one is when you put full body weight on a single spinous process, you are asking to develop spine instability. Don't do it. You would be far wiser to go pay a clever manual therapist who knows where to direct the therapy to and what tissue in your back. It's far too precious to be gross foam rolling it and smashing it with a ball. Now, as I said, that's for spines, and I don't have a basis for opinion on big extremities.
I'm glad you mentioned skilled body work. I think that's way undervalued. I think there's real merit in that if you've got a good practitioner.
Do you want an opinion on that, Ken? Yeah. Well, if you would have asked me that question 25 years ago, it would be different than my opinion today. And I would have dismissed it probably 25 years ago. But I can think of many times where I have been working with an athlete to rebuild them, and I can think of some very well-known Olympians from your country. And I would get so far, and I'm thinking of one where they had this deep little snag or niggle, whatever you want to call it, on the right side of their spine, and it was deep. And I did everything I could to desensitize the pain and build up their strength and power once again, but they couldn't get rid of this little snag that was in their back. I sent them to who I consider to be a very skilled manual therapist, and with 3 treatments with their fingers getting in on that structure, it happened to be quadratus lumborum. They cleaned up that athlete. They were back in the next Olympics performing famously. So it's just an example. And I mean, as you know, I've had a lot of trauma in my body. I've had hip replacement, etc. And I've had some very skilled therapists. One of them is in Florida, Dr. Clayton Skaggs, who has magnificent hands and I credit him for allowing me to keep my right hip for another 15 years. I was scheduled for hip replacement 15 years before I actually had it. And he was the Central Institute for Human Performance is based out of St. Louis. I would go to St. Louis because of his ability to allow me to walk pain-free for another 6 weeks. And then I would meet him somewhere else at another meeting. But he kept me going for 15 years. I went to other manual therapists who were brutal, and all they did was hurt me. So the skill in that person's hands is paramount. It's critical. But when you hit the right person, they are so much more valuable than a foam roller or
no comparison.
Something like that. Yeah.
So, Stuart, I'm kind of curious. So, I've talked to numerous friends who sustained back injuries, and it was specifically after they joined certain training programs that have focused on Olympic-style lifts with high reps. So, are you seeing increased numbers of spinal injuries, with the increased popularity of those type of training programs?
There's no question.
Yeah.
Absolutely, yes. I'll make two comments on that. Well, first of all, a comment about those styles of gyms that are doing that. I love them for the camaraderie and the atmosphere rallying around fitness.
Absolutely.
When you walk across our university campuses today, it's appalling.
No.
The soft people who are going to become leaders in our country, physically soft. So, but having said that, I'm very concerned, and I'm glad you asked this question, about the average person doing repeated multiple Olympic lifts. This is not wise, and it's the recipe for most people wrecking their backs for a good part of their life. When you go to the Olympic lifting countries, first of all, they highly select youths for Olympic training. They select them for two things: mobility in the shoulders and mobility in the hips, and an explosive neurometabolism. The strength is easy to build. That's the easiest thing to build of all. They do that later, but they look for the highly mobile kids with that explosive metabolism. In the U.S., it's quite the opposite. They look for a strong kid, and then they try and teach them to Olympic lift, and they don't have the hip mobility to go deep into the squat that I was describing earlier. So that's one issue. But having said that, Olympic lifting finds the athlete. It's not the other way around. Mm-hmm. So you've got to have very shallow hip sockets and mobile shoulders and the ability to relax and snap under the bar. Otherwise, the stress will eventually outstrip the pace of adaptation and you'll get hurt. Now let's look at how Olympic lifters train. Olympic lifters don't miss lifts. They don't go to exhaustion or to fatigue because you are creating a tape in muscle memory, a tape of perfection. The Olympic lifters say, I've been working my whole life for one perfect lift, and they are trying to encode that in muscle memory. If you lift when you're fatigued, you pollute muscle memory and you ruin it. You'll never be a great lifter. So they only lift singles and doubles. I don't know any of them. And I've worked with a lot of and I'm talking real Olympian lifters. They lift much fewer reps, and they never get tired. They train like sprinters. They don't pollute that engram or that tape in their brain with fatigue patterns. But what do they do at these gyms that train multiple lifts? They break form, and you get hurt when you break form. And the tissues will, the cumulative load outstrips the pace of repair. I ask them, what's your training cycle? And they look at me, well, what do you mean? I said, when was your last week off? Well, what do you mean? I'm going for my personal best. Mm-hmm. Anyway, I'm afraid it's not the exercises that are bad. I have seen some good coaching. And I've seen some pathetic coaching from coaches who say, oh, I'm a really good coach.
Right.
Yeah.
But anyway, the programming doesn't make sense. Some of the mobility work, they'll do 10 burpees, for example, which is softening the collagen of the spine. And then they go and do 10 Olympic lifts. Well, you're greatly increasing the risk when you really don't need to.
You've said from a broad perspective, one good way to prevent low back injury is to avoid high spine power. Could you elaborate on that a little? Yeah,
power from a body perspective and a joint is force times velocity. So a high power event will cause back injury. You want low power. And what I mean by that is it's force times velocity. So think of a golf swing. A golf swing is low power because the velocity is high of rotation, but the muscle force is low. So it's low power. Now let's take a power lift, a deadlift, or an Olympic lift where they really don't move the spine at all. The velocity is low, but the force is very high. Once again, it's very low power. The problem occurs when you put high load through the spine, so the force is high, and then you move it with higher velocity. Mm-hmm. And this has been shown in occupational groups. The wonderful studies of Bill Maris, for example, at Ohio State University, has shown in spades that those who get back pain use and create higher spine power, more force, more spine velocity. So if the spine is high, if the spine force is high, don't move it. And if the velocity is high, don't put much load on it.
So it's just an observation, but notice that there's a direct correlation between back pain or injury and a person's ability to brace. So people who never learn how to brace seem to suffer from back injury. Is this something that we're not teaching our kids by removing basic manual labor around the house like we used to have to do?
I don't have an evidence foundation that comes to mind very quickly to give an evidence-based answer on that. But I would just call upon my own experience and common sense. When we were kids, our dads taught us how to throw a hay bale, mm-hmm. and there was a skill to it. And if you didn't do it right, you were too sore to get out there and harvest the next day. So they would teach you work, rest. They would teach you technique and how to brace and how to breathe, how to shovel manure. You throw the shovel in, you let the shovel do the work. And I remember my dad sharpening the spade, and people say, "What are you doing? And you never put away a spade dirty, mm-hmm. because tomorrow it has too much friction on it and you'll have to do too much work." So, we were all taught how to work. And, it just breaks my heart. I would watch the kids being driven into school, and they'd waddle out of their mother's car and into class. And it just used to break my heart. Instead of mm-hmm. letting little Johnny load up his backpack, teach him when his shoulder gets tired, switch the pack to the other side. We just call that interval training. And go get some physicality before you. Anyway, I hope you appreciate that answer.
Yeah, absolutely.
In fact, continuing on that theme, on this theme that as a culture, many among us are becoming rather soft, sort of snowflakes. There's some new research this year, 2016, last year, 2016, showing that taken as a whole, young men have much less grip strength than their parents. This is, I guess, not surprising. And this is comparing 1985, which is, very recent, actually. So in 1985, men 20 to 24 had an average right-handed grip strength of 121 pounds, which is not exceptional. I would imagine that would be average, and a left-handed grip strength of 105. Today, according to this paper, men of that same age had only 101-pound grip strength in the right hand and 99 in the left. That's a huge drop. I mean, it's a really significant degradation in grip strength in a very short time. And as you know, grip strength has in the past been strongly correlated with longevity. And I don't know, do you have any thoughts on that, Stu?
Yeah, I have a lot of thoughts on it. I call them computer hands. And hands are much, much smaller and weaker. We work on rope pulling, hand over hand, or firefighter hose training to keep and preserve that grip athleticism. It's supremely important, and it greatly limits the expression of athleticism. If you can bench press 400 pounds and can't grip and control
you've got nothing.
Items, you've got nothing. And athletes are sometimes surprised when they come to me and they come with a bad back, and I say, "Oh, by the way, you need more grip strength, son." You need more grip athleticism. and shake my hand and squeeze it as hard as you can. And if you don't, you're going to die. And then they have no idea what I'm talking about. And they grip my hand. And I, you can feel if they've been trained on a barbell and nothing else, because the outside of their hand is dead. They squeeze you with their first two fingers. And then I teach them the athleticism of how to grip with every single finger. Spread your fingers, focus your brain, harden your whole body, and squeeze. And we were talking about kettlebell swings and
bottoms up carry will work some grip.
It does. But then also rope pulling. So you were talking about sled dragging before.
Rope climbing too.
Rope climbing is not possible for a lot of our little kids these days, I'm afraid.
Are the lawyers?
Yeah. But to just set up a sled at the end of the rope and then set yourself heels in the ground and then pull the sled in hand over hand is a wonderful grip strength. And throw away those gloves that I see in the weight room because someone's going to lift a barbell or two. I don't know about you. I was never allowed to wear work gloves. You had to develop white things on your hands called calluses and develop a pair of grippers.
So, Stuart, perhaps we can say that our younger generation is losing their grip.
I should. Well, I've just retired at the university, so I can probably say this. But when I started, and again, I was a professor for 32 years, but once in a while we would the students we'd talk about training and I know it's frowned upon down in the U.S. Professors fraternizing with their students, but in Canada it's no big deal. The drinking age is lower. We do these sorts of things with students. And we'll talk about athletes, and then I'll say it'll come around. They want an arm wrestling lesson. And I didn't lose that often. And I'm the old white-haired man, and I would show them all the techniques of, try and get your opponent to smile a bit. Break their game face, and they break the density of the neural drive. They didn't know how to get a good grip on an opponent and how to post with latissimus dorsi and break open the opponent's elbow and then fire through the core. Anyway, I would arm wrestle with them. And of course, I would use a lot of dirty tricks from biomechanics and neurology. I would use every dirty trick in the book. And some of them would get embarrassed by some, but some of them would love it.
Yeah.
And it was fun. And just to learn manual hand athleticism once again. Someone forgot to teach that to them.
Yep.
The last piece of research that I'd like you to talk about just briefly is you've been doing some amazing work that probably couldn't happen in many places with your graduate student, Natalie, looking at the kinds of injuries and how to mitigate the pain associated with sex. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Absolutely. Throughout our career, we've found our research questions by interacting with clinicians and asking them, what is the biggest question that you need the answer to be better at your job? And we kept hearing from clinicians, couples come to us. They are celibate. They've been celibate for half a year because the last time they had sex, they knackered their back so badly, they are now fearful of risking it again. But there's absolutely zero guidelines for clinicians. Now, I thought that, boy, this would have been studied before, but it hadn't. So we went through our IRB, or ethics committee, and I had these discussions with Natalie Sidorkowitz, my graduate student, a very brave woman. And anyway, to make a long story short, we had couples into the lab. We set it up. We had the same system that's used in Hollywood. You know the movie Avatar, where they would put little infrared markers over the actors' bodies, and then the software would reconstruct their bodies in 3D, and then you render the muscles and all that sort of stuff. We used exactly the same system, and we measured back load, hip motion, knee motion, and all this sort of stuff. And we were then able to create an atlas for clinicians. So the clinician would then find out what the pain provocator was of that particular person's back. Maybe it was a flexion motion, maybe it was a compression or a shear load. But nonetheless, they would subcategorize the pain trigger, and then on the atlas, we would show, try this technique and avoid this for each condition. And for the first time, clinicians now have an atlas to guide their advice to patients. Do you want me to talk about orgasm for a second?
No, this will be an all-time first on STEM Talk.
I never thought 5 years, even let's say 6 or 7 years ago.
Does this have to do with retirement?
Well, that's another story, but I would never have guessed 7 years ago that I would mention the word orgasm in public. But it turns out we were the first, unbeknownst to us, to measure orgasm. So then the Kinsey Institute in the States, who's not allowed to perform these experiments in your country, the repository of sexual health science, have now partnered with us to study these things.
They've offshored orgasm.
Yeah. Well, it's funny, the letters that we have to give to patients that are coming up from the Kinsey to get across our border. You're coming to do what? Nonetheless, when we measured the male orgasm, it is a non-event in some men in terms of strength of muscle contraction. So it's not a big deal. But we found in other men, they would deviate their spine to an extreme of a range of motion and then contract their hip muscles and core muscles to 100% contraction. Very violent. Can you imagine putting your spine in the most awkward position and then contracting the muscles 100%? It's no wonder you hurt your back. So we are now able at the stage to show them ways to avoid those deviated postures and give them a chart with little rendered figures.
Oh boy.
And it's kind of fun. But, to have an intelligent conversation with adults instead of treating them like 5-year-olds. And they say this, thank you. Again, you're the first person who's spoken to us like a 5-year-old and recognized we have a problem. It's not in our heads. And anyway, maybe that's a fun way to finish up.
It is, and it once again reinforces my original observation that your lab is remarkably broad in its scope.
Well, I don't know. Maybe I just have attention deficit disorder and I get bored quickly. And
sounds like a fun place.
Yeah,
that's fantastic. So, Stuart, it's been fantastic having you on STEM Talk, and thank you so much for joining us today.
Oh, thanks so much, Don.
Yeah.
It was a lot of fun.
Yeah.
Thank you, Stu.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Ken. And again, Ken, for your hospitality here. It's been fantastic. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
STEM Talk. STEM Talk. STEM Talk. STEM Talk.
So I really love the fact that Stu looks at a back patient as a whole human being from the time they actually get out of their car at his office to listening to their story. That's such a unique approach and makes so much sense given how important a healthy spine is for just about everything that we do.
Yeah, that's a good observation, Don. And he's really like that. I could tell he was looking at, how you know if somebody's watching you?
Yeah.
You get out of the car, Nancy and I get out of the car, it's snowing, right? We get out of the car and we're trying to get our stuff together, and you see the windows, the curtains are a crack open, and he's watching, and then you come in and he tells you right away, he says, I'm really strict on shoes in the house. Gotta take your shoes off. And he's a little bench there. So he wants to see how you bend down and how you sit on the bench and how do you get down to your shoelaces? How do you do that? He is watching everything.
Which is fascinating because physicians are,
Yeah, this guy's on a different level.
Yeah.
This was an information-packed episode on a topic that will, over time, affect most people in one way or another. I have certainly benefited from my sojourn to the snowy north and continue to practice his methods.
Well, if you enjoyed this interview as much as we did, I invite you to visit the STEM Talk webpage where you can find the show notes for this and other episodes, stemtalk.us. This is Dawn Carnegie signing off for now.
And this is Ken Ford saying goodbye until we meet again on STEM Talk.
Thank you for listening to STEM Talk. We want this podcast to be discovered by others. So please take a minute to go to iTunes to rate the podcast and perhaps even write a review. More information about this and other episodes can be found at our website, stemtalk.us. There, you can also find more information about the guests we interview.